Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Astrid Tuminas, and I'm the Vice Dean for Research at the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. We are very fortunate this afternoon to have with us Mr. Robert Herbold, who is an adjunct professor at the Kuan Yew School. That may not be his first affiliation, but because we like to do marketing for the Kuan Yew School, we'll mention that as his first affiliation. I will just say a few things about our guest today, who will speak on what's holding you back. 10 bold steps that define gutsy leaders. In Bob Herbold's bio, brief bio here, is essentially 2 companies that he's been involved with, and both terrific companies, Procter & Gamble for 26 years, and then Microsoft for 7 years as COO. He was brought into Microsoft by Bill Gates to serve as Executive Vice President and COO from 1994 to 2001. And during his 7 years as COO, Microsoft experienced a 4-fold increase in revenue and a 7-fold increase in profits. I want my life to increase 4-fold in revenue and profits like this, so I hope I'll get insights on that today. And he's also the author of 3 books. I'll just mention 2. One is called Seduced by Success, and the other, of course, What's Holding You Back, which you can get outside the room today. So without further ado, let me turn over the time to him. He will give his talk, and then we will have a Q&A session. Please.
Great. Thanks. This talk is very practical. It's full of examples of companies that some of which you will immediately know about because you either are a customer or you somehow have read about them. But the subject is really why, when put in a leadership position, will often, especially if they get promoted several levels, where all of a sudden the decisions they're faced with are a lot harder, will all of a sudden start wimping out regularly and simply find ways to get out of it. So we're going to study that problem, why it happens, and then we're going to look at some examples and some principles that will hopefully be useful to you in terms of how do you deal with these kind of leadership situations. So I've got a set of slides here, and I will get over here so that I'm not standing in the way. The first company I want to talk about is Fiat. Not big in Europe, but huge, or not big in Asia, but huge in Europe. In fact, in Italy, it's often said that the head of Fiat is right up there with the Pope in terms of importance. So this is a company that over the years has been very key. It was founded in 1899, goes way back. Agnelli family, Giovanni was the founder, and then the company was run by members of the Agnelli family for a long time. They did some very innovative things. They launched assembly production at basically the same time Henry Ford did, although Henry gets most of the publicity. They introduced diesel automobiles at a very early stage. They've bought such entities as Ferrari and others over the years. It's been a company that's been very dynamic, very innovative, and very well thought of until the late 1990s, mid-90s, late 90s, and the like. That's what we're going to study. In '83, the grandson of the founder becomes chairman. In 1999, that's 100 years after this company was founded, it was still 30% owned by 100 different, roughly 100 members of the family. So very tight family control. And that turns out to be just a huge negative for this company. In 2000, and we'll talk about that a bit later. In 2001, they lost over $1 billion. Basically, the problem was all these companies that they were involved with, they were running them very, very poorly, particularly automobiles. But they were in too many things. They were too diversified. They were in insurance, energy, publishing, and about 6 or 7 other businesses that I don't list there. But when you get that kind of lack of focus, you know you're going to be in trouble unless you massively decentralize the company. And the family wouldn't dare think of decentralizing this place. This was the family jewel. In 2001, in a panic mode, they did something rather amazing. They sold 20% of this company to General Motors and got $2.4 billion for it. And they also, in that deal, got a put so that they could put the whole company to GM. Now, what's that a signal of? That's a signal that they have no confidence that they're going to be able to run this company and in a way that it can survive. Now, the thing that's really amazing is this is 2001, and General Motors is coughing up $2.4 billion to give to this company. I don't know which move was dumber, the GM part of it or the Fiat part of it. But both, you got to raise your eyebrows and say, what in the world are these people thinking? So in 2002, Business Week, the publication cited that their view is that Fiat is finished. It looked like the end. 2002, the market share in the automobile part of the business, which was the yeoman's part of the company. The large majority of the volume, the revenue, and the profits came from the auto business. It was down 33% versus 7 years ago, so it was just a steady decline in market share during the late 90s and early 2000s. 2002, they lost $700 million. The share price in 2002 dropped 55% versus a year ago. This is an amazing statistic. During that period, from 2000 to 2003, they had 4 different CEOs in this company. That's hard to do. I mean, it's amazing. But the funny thing is they were all either family members or they were friends of family members. So again, it continues to be very tight-knit. And you can just imagine the peer pressure to not do anything of significance or not take any risk. And so that was a core problem. The company was clearly on its way to bankruptcy. In 2003, each of the brands were run totally autonomously. They had 19 different automobile platforms, what's a platform? A platform is the frame, the drivetrain, the engine, the drive shaft, the differential, et cetera. And normally with a large car company, you have a chassis for a small car, you have a chassis for a medium-sized car, and one for a large car if you produce large cars. And then you put the body on those chassis that fits that particular brand that you're managing. So you might have 5 different models of Ford all using the same chassis. In this case, every brand had their own chassis. Now that is a very expensive way and inefficient way to run a large automobile company. Weak styling and branding. The branding part of this operation was in terrible shape. Fiat's Stilo was viewed by the industry as a quote as ugly and costly. You get the idea. The brand itself was viewed as boxy and uninspired from a design standpoint. This company was in deep, deep trouble. So why does this kind of thing happen? Why do we see companies? I mean, we could be talking about many different companies here. We could be talking just as easily about General Motors. We could be talking about Kodak. If you go back in Kodak's history in 1995, they were the king of photography. One of the 10 most admired companies in the world by Fortune magazine. Today, it looks like Kodak is just going to have to go out of business. I mean, they've completely lost the photography business. They're trying to be a printer company, but it's just a Me Too product. So they missed the technology revolution. And you say, These are companies that can hire smart people. It's not an issue of intelligence, so to speak. It's an issue of just raw leadership, of making the hard decisions and sticking with them. And typically, as we're about to learn, the hard decisions are not intricate. They're not deep. You don't need a rocket scientist to figure them out. I mean, when you're producing cars that are out of whack from a cost standpoint and are ugly, okay, and that's what the press says and that's what your consumer research says, you have a problem. And a company like General Motors, they watched that for 25 years as the market share went from 50% down to 19%. You say, wow, they hire all these smart people off of the best universities in the world. How do they do that? Well, it's simply lack of courage to make the tough decisions and to move people out and simplify the system so that you can get some meaningful work done. The reason why these tough decisions don't get made are really a lack of courage, as I just mentioned. But let's analyze for a moment what really is a tough decision. What are we talking about here? At a lower level, when you're in a lower level job in an organization, most of the decisions you make are driven by some set of numbers, and they're fairly straightforward. But as you get up in the organization and get more responsibility, decisions get tougher. And here are the characteristics that I'm talking about. I'm talking about decisions where there's no ideal option. There are many alternatives, and you're going to eventually have to select one. There's a lack of information, a lack of data in regard to which is the best alternative that we should select. A tough decision usually has a component where no matter which alternative you select, some group is going to be disappointed. And many people will back away from making any decision and simply analyze because they don't want to disappoint anybody, okay? Another characteristic is that often these are decisions where long-term perspectives are needed. Often short-term Band-Aids are available just to get the problem off of your desk so that you don't have to deal with it, and hopefully you'll get a different job so that your successor has to deal with it. And that mentality is alive and well in organizations. So, yeah, it's cutting in and out. He's picking my pocket here. Sure. See if that works. So what happens when they face these kind of alternatives that are so difficult, that are so tough? How's it going back there? Good. So when people face these decisions, what do? They often delay. They'll further analyze, especially if you got an engineering mentality. I don't want to, say negative things about engineers, but they do have a tendency to believe all problems are solvable. They massively compromise, and they'll give in. They will say, okay, let's treat this like a team, and let's all agree. And we're going to talk about that phenomenon a little later. That's the recipe for disaster. So consensus can, in certain settings, can really hurt you. Many people will simply say, that's not an issue, I don't want to deal with it. Just ignore the whole thing, or find some kind of excuse to get out of the, and not have to deal with it. So human beings create some very funny behaviors to deal with these kinds of situations. But really, why are they delaying? Why are they avoiding it? In many cases, they don't want the conflict. A lot of people are simply not comfortable with conflict. And they don't want to confront a problem or confront another person in regard to how they view the situation and how it should be done versus some other point of view. Sometimes they're striving for certainty. They're just going to analyze until it's dead clear which alternative should be selected. Sometimes they're trying to avoid a career risk. there are individuals that you work with that are not going to take a risk with their boss. They're not going to do anything that they don't believe their boss would agree with. In fact, the worst disease of all is simply to watch the boss and to try to do everything that you believe he or she would do. That becomes pretty clear pretty quickly. Lack of self-confidence, lack of sense of urgency. So these are all these human elements that go to work when we're facing these kinds of tough problems. So the question is, what do you do? How do you provide this kind of really strong leadership that's needed with these kinds of tough decisions? Now, you'll read a lot of theory in regard to leadership, and some of it relates to the old dialogue of, are leaders born or are they developed? You'll read dialogue in regard to the importance of charisma and style and speaking ability and the like. And really, when you boil it all down, it's not how you do things, it's what you do, okay? And the intent of this book is to lay out what a leader should do, what a manager should do to truly be a strong leader. I'm going to cover three or four of these principles in this talk, and I can't cover them all that's in the book, but these are the ones that I believe are the most important. Well, I should say that by not dealing with these tough decisions, what happens in an organization? You get all kind of complexity. What happens often is people hire too many people. They dream up new systems and all kinds of complexity as to how to run the organization. Another thing that occurs is they apply the consensus model that everybody has to agree with everything, and that just absolutely suffocates innovation. And so innovation goes down quickly. So that's the implications of all this. Now, let's go back to our fiat example, and then we'll step back and look at a few principles that we think are operating. What happened in the fiat situation? It's very interesting, because we stopped at the end of 2003 when, in fact, the company was right on the verge of bankruptcy. Marvelously, the board finally acted, and they selected a really strong individual that was completely outside the family and, in fact, completely outside the company. His name was Sergio Marchioni. His background was finance. He was also the CEO of a chemical company. So he came in with no experience whatsoever in the automobile business, but he also came in with a great pedigree as a very strong leader. Now, what did he do? Within 3 months, he basically cleaned house at that level that had reported to the CEO. He knew that he needed some fresh thinking. Oftentimes, these people might not be weak performers. You just need new thinking. What happens with people, especially when they're in a job for a long time, long being 3 years or more, is they begin to think that they've got the job figured out. And they think they've got some rules of thumb as to how to operate. I mean, how many times have you been put into a new job and at first you're very uncomfortable? Then after about 6 months, you say to yourself, wow, I think I've got this figured out. I think I know how to operate. And after a year, you're feeling quite confident in regard to handling things. When you achieve that level, you're about to start the ramp downhill. Because what's happening is every time you face a new situation, basically your brain is saying, ha, we've solved something like that before. And they pull out the template. There's a famous creative thinker by the name of De Bono who teaches creativity. Some of you may have heard of this incredible character. He has a theory as to what the brain is. The brain, he says, is a file cabinet. And every time you have an experience in life, you put a file in the brain, okay? Then when you face new situations, the first thing your brain does is it goes to the file cabinet and pull out files that are as similar as possible to the situation that you're viewing and attempts to instruct you to follow these steps. said another way, as you get older and older, your ability to think fresh thoughts, in his view, gets compromised. And he has all kinds of practices where he can, hopefully, he believes, train people to basically stop your brain from pulling the file out of the file cabinet, so to speak. Very interesting stuff. But it's related to what this guy did. He put fresh blood at the top of the company. He also did something very important. He interviewed the 2 or 3 levels below the CEO in order to try to figure out who were some of the younger people that truly were excellent and doing very, very good work that he could really stretch. One thing we do in organizations all the time is we hire too many people, and secondly, we don't, consequently, they're buried in the organization, and we don't pick the really strong performers and continually stretch. Because the strong performers, and in fact humans in general, if you're clear with them as to what you want done, and you're clear with them in terms of what the measures are, they usually perform very, very well. So he got a lot of fresh thinking into the company. He cut the staff 10%. He cut out 2 layers. When you hire too many people, what you do is sooner or later you say, well, I need to promote some of these people, but I've got people in the existing jobs, so what do? Well, I create a new layer. And what that does is you get this proliferation of bosses, okay? Most of which don't have enough to do. Typically, they only have 3 or 4 people reporting to them. And there's nothing worse than a boss who doesn't have enough to do. If you ever work for one of these people, they will meddle, they will stick their nose in your business, and you don't feel like you're accountable for anything because they're a pest. It's because they basically are trying to find something to do. Well, he also dismantled the fiefdoms that were built around these individual platforms and brands and began to put some efficiencies in the manufacturing part of this company, which it badly needed. This is really hilarious. He also wanted to get out of this arrangement with General Motors because he thought it was embarrassing that he's carrying around this ability to dump the company on GM. His point of view is, we're going to save this company. I don't need this kind of out. So he goes to General Motors and he offers them a deal where if they pay him $2 billion, he will tear up the put. And General Motors agreed. So let's think about this for a moment. So first, he gets $2.4 billion from GM, and then he gets another 2 by tearing up the agreement that he got the $2.4 billion for. Yeah. A put is where, suppose I'm Fiat and you're General Motors, okay? It's a contract between you and me that says I have the right to take this company and put it on you, and you have to buy it at current market value. You have to do it, okay? You've heard of options in the stock market. That's where the term put is borrowed from here. So it's my ability to basically force you to buy the company at market price. You have to do it.
So GM just got rid of $4 billion for fun.
Sheer stupidity. Well, I mean, that's consistent with everything else they've done. So, I mean, this is a company that took a brand that was the #1 automobile in America, the Oldsmobile Cutlass, and finally had to discontinue the model 30 years later. I mean, this is a bunch of people, highly talented, highly intelligent people from the best universities in the world. This is what they act like. So there's really some interesting things that go on within organizations. The fact is they had way too many people, and all they do is look around and worry about what others are doing in the company as opposed to increasing their impact. Anyway, he introduced a crossover. SUVs became unpopular. Fiat did not have a crossover, which was basically a small SUV on a medium-sized car chassis. So we introduced what was called a Panda Cross, which was very successful because crossovers were very, very hot at that point in time. There's also a car called the Fiat 500, which is a very small car. If any of you are from Europe, back in the 70s and 80s, this was really a cool car. They drove it into the ground, had to discontinue it, and he brought back the Fiat 500. So he's a hero in Italy. 2006, their market share already 2 years after this guy's there is up to 11% versus the 8% when he started with the company. Revenue is up 35% versus year ago in 2006. They announced their first dividend in 5 years. So this guy, in a very short period of time, simply made the tough decisions. They were dead obvious what needed to be done. Fresh talent, cars that people like, and fix the cost structure. I mean, it's not deep. It's just a matter of, okay, we have to do it. He became basically the industry leader on a global basis by 2009. This was the best run car company in the world. Ford would be second, where they hired a very good person from Boeing to save that franchise, and he's done a very good job. So those are two great stories in the automobile business, and normally the automobile business does not have great stories when it comes to leadership. It was also in 2009 when he saw General Motors and Chrysler going bankrupt. And this is the guy that went to the US government and said, I'll make you a deal. I'll give you Fiat technologies for small cars, which you know you're going to have to make and sell, in trade for 32% of the Chrysler franchise as you take this thing through bankruptcy. So coming out of bankruptcy, I want to own 32% of Chrysler, and I'll provide all the core technologies that were needed. The US government agreed, and so today they own 32% of Chrysler. Now, most people in the automobile industry believe that the only reason he picked up Chrysler, without putting a dollar on the table, by the way, you'll notice, is that he wants to scrap all the Chrysler cars and simply use the dealerships in order to take the Fiat 500, this small car that's very cool, and market it in the United States. So we'll see if that turns out to be true. So here is this example, just oozes the kind of strong leadership that's needed in an organization. But it's not hard. You just look around and say, what are our big problems? And let's solve them and stop fooling around. So let's talk about some key principles. The first one is what I just cited. Number one thing you need to do in an organization when you're put in charge is to look around and confront reality. And a lot of people don't want to confront reality because those are the hard decisions. You know you have problems and it's time to fix them. Or you know you have new technologies and it's time to jump on them in order to get ahead of your competition. You need to do those things with a vengeance. Once you isolate the opportunities or the problems, you need to quickly develop the plan, and you engage the organization as to how to tackle these things, but you don't debate it forever, okay? You get everybody's input, you take a position on what you think is right, you get more input on that position, and then you go. And you fix things on the fly if you've made mistakes. I want to talk about another car example, Hyundai, because in terms of confronting reality and developing a really concise plan to fix it, this is a prize example. In 1999, they were the 12th largest manufacturer in the world of automobiles. They were just starting to sell their cars in the United States. Their culture was sales, period, sales, okay? Cars weren't that good looking. In fact, the reliability was questionable. In fact, quality and styling were clearly second priority at this company. First priority is sell, you know? They want revenue. So in the United States, right out of the starting gate, Hyundai equals poor quality. I mean, it had a terrible quality reputation. Not just a reputation, but all the big surveys, like the J.D. Powers survey, which is a big auto industry survey on reliability and quality, these people were very low. So what happened? In 1999, similar to the Fiat situation, the board finally decided they're going to need a new leader. So they select a guy named Chung-Wong Koo, and he comes in and within the first month says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to become number 5. We're going to boost the sales to the 5th position, but we're going to do it by being number 1 in quality in the US. Why the US? Because that's the toughest market in terms of quality. If we can pass the test there in quality, we'll be fine globally, because they're the people that measure it the best in the industry. The measure is the J.D. Powers survey that I just mentioned before. So he went publicly to this company and said, okay, clear the deck. We're reorganizing completely around quality. That's number 1 priority, and that's going to be our tool for boosting sales. He replaced most of the top execs in this company, which happened to be salespeople and finance people, with engineers, because he knew if he was going to have to get serious about quality, he needed some people who could really do a fine job in the engineering of the automobiles. He appointed reliability and quality experts and execs in each of the operating divisions. He tied compensation of the top people to the quality ratings that I referenced earlier. And also those quality execs that I mentioned earlier had veto power over new models. So, and there are stories of models at Hyundai getting right to the point where they're about to introduce them and they get pulled back for quality reasons. That happened numerous times. So this guy was tough in terms of what he wanted to do in the company, but he was also very clear and very simple with the overall strategy. By 2007, they were up to number 6 in sales. In 2007, the Hyundai Sonata, which is the medium-priced model of Hyundai, was the most reliable car on the market by the J.D. Powers survey. Today, in the last several years, they're always in the top 5 on quality, usually tying companies like, or brands like Mercedes and Lexus. I mean, these people are producing a car that is unbelievable given where they were back in 1999 and 2000. Today, they're virtually tied for 5th in sales. So it's an incredible success story. But what happened? What went on here? Basically, they faced reality. They had severe quality problems, so let's solve it. And they got serious about doing that, which means you get the right people in the right place, you reorganize around quality, and set up the measures so that you know whether you're accomplishing it or not. Okay, another principle, very clear, very simple, staff for success. If you want to win, you need winners, okay? You need people who have a track record of doing good things. The fact is, if you have a person who, generally speaking, if you look at the last 4 or 5 jobs, has been quite successful and done quality work, the probability that they're going to do that again in a new job, very high, okay? You need to take advantage of that. It's not deep science. I want to talk about spotting these people, though, because many organizations do a pitiful job in performance appraisal and spotting talent and telling talented people that they're talented. It turns out managers in general are very reluctant to criticize one of their employees, and they're also very reluctant to tell an employee that they're really good. It's an incredible phenomenon that really hurts their potential in terms of tapping great people, but also dealing with the lower level and getting them in a job that's going to work. At Microsoft, they had in my estimation, a world-class performance appraisal system. Who would have guessed? I came from Procter & Gamble when I went to Microsoft, and Procter & Gamble does a great job with people. So my view was, I suspect that this company is going to be very weak in terms of personnel practices. I guess I've been standing with my back to the camera the whole time, huh? Oh, it's back here too. That's good. But anyway, this performance appraisal system was very unique. It was developed by Bill Gates himself when the company had about 20 people. And let me tell you, he protected this system with a vengeance because he knew it was a secret in terms of isolating top talent and then developing it. This is rude, but I got to tell you what it is. And it really worked. It was a 5-point system where if you work for Microsoft, you're going to get either a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5 as a rating this year for your performance. 5 means you are really strong, okay? You are superb. 4, you're very good. You're above average, you're very good. You're not quite up to that top level. A 3 means you're right in that mid-range, you're a solid citizen. 2 means you have some problems and you need to work on them. And a 1 means you have serious problems. And in fact, we're going to work on it for 3 months. And if we can't work it out, we're going to find you a new job. It'll probably be outside of the company. But maybe it'll be inside because it's just a bad fit that you're in. Now, here's the interesting part. It was a forced distribution. So all the managers at department head level or above had to have these ratings adhere to the following percentages. They had to have 10% of their people rated as a 5, 20% as a 4, 50% as a 3, 15% as a 2, and 5% as a 1. Said another way, it's truly a slightly positively shifted bell-shaped curve, okay? And the intent every year is to improve the overall pool of talent at Microsoft. The thing that I loved about it was the fact that it absolutely forced you to have a dialogue with people on the positive end, which is a good thing. It happened once a year, and there was a February checkpoint where you would have a discussion with the employee in regard to how's it going. It was tied to the salary system. What happens in many organizations is that the good people, the really strong people, don't get, I mean, suppose, for example, this year the salary increase average is going to be 5%. What many companies do is they say, okay, the really strong people, we'll give them 6.5 or maybe 7. And the weak people, oh, they'll get 4 or 3.5%. Said another way, no differentiation to speak of. You know, how's a person supposed to know they're really good if they're basically getting a salary increase that's about like the average, maybe a little bit better? The really strong companies, I got to tell you, if it's an average 5% increase, the top people should get 15. You know, they should get a big boost. They're making big contributions to the company. Similarly, the person who gets a 1 ought to get 0. All right, they're not hacking it, and we need to confront that and be honest with one another. What's really bad is to not deal with the poor performers and to just let them languish and languish. First of all, it clogs up the company with people who aren't very good. And secondly, it sends a signal to your top people, this is not the place to work, okay? Because they really don't appreciate big contributions. So it's a big problem. This system also required participation. Now, how did that work? Because in most performance appraisal systems, eventually it atrophies to a point where it doesn't happen. Why is that? Because if I'm the supervisor and you're the subordinate, and we're thinking about a performance appraisal meeting, you don't want to have the meeting happen, because even if you're good, I'm going to sit there as the boss and try to pick at you a bit and name some things that aren't going well. It's no fun. As a supervisor, I don't want to have the meeting either, because it's no fun to sit there and criticize people. It's an unnatural act, you could claim. And so what happens in many companies, even though HR will once a year send all the fancy forms out and the like, is the whole process just atrophies, and people don't get the quality input that they deserve. And they also don't get confronted in terms of poor performance when they should. At Microsoft, this system, you had to document the performance appraisal. The subordinate wrote it up, worked it with the boss, and eventually both people signed, and they submitted that form to HR. If HR in a particular department didn't have all the forms that were signed by both the subordinate and the supervisor, nobody got paid that month, okay? Nobody. And so every department head worked very hard to make sure that all these performance appraisals got submitted, and they were all signed by both parties, indicating that they just about had to have a dialogue of some type because the rating number is on that form. So it was a great system that I deeply appreciated because your strong players did very, very well. You knew who they were, and you were able to stretch them and move them around, and you dealt with weak performers. I can't tell you the number of examples in terms of weak performance where when you really get into it, it's usually a very bad match between the job and the individual. And oftentimes the conclusion is, you know, I really wanted to do something else. And yes, I'm not happy here. But anyway, the important thing is to have the discussion. So staffing is key. You need, yeah.
Who decides what points scale? Is it your peers, your subordinates, your boss?
Boss.
It's just your boss.
Correct. And they do surveys, both what's called 360 interviews. So you get input from the peers of that individual. You get input, if they're a boss, you get input from the subordinates, and you get input from the level of above. And then it's a judgment call. But that judgment call then gets worked up the system and often changed, not often, but sometimes changed. You have department heads who would come in and say, you don't understand, I have all great people. I can't tell you the number of times I had that dialogue, where a person would come in and say, well, 10% fives, I can't live with that. I have 15. 20% fours, I can't live with that. I have 30%. In fact, I don't have any ones. I have really good people. Why are they saying that? Because that's a cop-out, okay? They don't want to confront the weak performers. But in the process of working through the ratings and working them up and down before the employee is told, okay, a lot of that gets sorted out. So you might say, well, is it flawed in that human judgment is involved? Absolutely, okay? There's no such thing as a flawless approach to performance appraisal. Some judgment is needed, so. Yes? Doesn't it generate what? No, because they would get marked very low. Because you're after people who are getting things done. Well, then the boss would get dinged because his people aren't producing. So the fact is, it usually, yeah, can people get away with that for a while? A little while. But the fact is, it's all about, it should be, all about performance and what the organization is trying to achieve. Now, in the case of Microsoft, this is different from many other systems. Some companies use a force distribution, some don't. Some don't use 5-point. I'm not here to say that a 5-point system is perfect. But I am here to say that you need to isolate the strong performers, you need to isolate the weak performers, and you need to stroke the people in the middle because they should be deeply appreciated because they're the ones that are carrying the organization. So performance appraisal system ought to have those kinds of components. Yeah? That's very a good question in that HR sometimes can help you out significantly if you see a boss that is in fact ignoring input, important input from other people, or there's simply a mismatch in terms of where the boss is coming out on this person versus generally what you've seen of them. And the people above that rank usually can intervene and create that dialogue. So that's very important. Let's go on to the next point, which is all about consensus and accountability. Let me go through an example, and then we'll step back and talk about this particular principle. In 2000 to 2006, I don't want to pick on automobile companies, but Ford, shape. Their stock price went from $30 down to $7.50. Their core problem, as with most auto companies that are in trouble, is their costs are out of whack and they have boring cars. And that was the case with Ford. In 2006, they got a new CEO. I referenced him earlier when I was talking about Fiat. The guy's name was Alan Mulally. He's still there. And he was from Boeing. What was Ford's problem? Well, in example of 2007, I'll talk about a model that they were developing. But the core problem was inappropriate use of teams and consensus. There's a time to use a team, and there's a time not to. And I want to talk about that. In the case of Ford Fusion, this is the new model that they were about to put in the market in 2007. Well, in 2006, I should say. They launched it in 2006. By 2007, it was a very sick situation. The car wasn't doing well. Why? Because it didn't have all the goodies. It didn't have a navigation system, satellite radios, side airbags, all the things that its competitors, namely the cars like Hyundai Sonata and the like, had all these things. And you might say, well, why didn't it have all these features? And the reason why is because finance didn't concur, okay? Finance didn't agree. They wanted to keep the cost of this car low. So they demanded they wouldn't sign off on it until these things were removed. So they achieved their goal, but got the cost low. And the only problem is the car was not appealing. What did Mulally do? He basically said, car designs are a very personal thing. We need one person in charge of the design of that car, not a consensus model where everybody gets to have input. One thing that's true about products, great products and great marketing, and also any kind of major change, is it has distinctive elements to it that they're basically sharp edges, and they make people uncomfortable at first because they're unique. If you expose products, new ideas, etc., to a consensus mentality, what do? They put the idea on the table, and each person around the table will say, well, I don't like that, it makes me uncomfortable, chop that off, chop that off, chop that off. By the time you get done, what you have is an idea that's acceptable to everyone. And it turns out to be called average, okay? Because basically you've averaged the input from these people. And it's a process that leads to mediocrity by design. Now, where is that useful? It's useful when you're trying to remove variability. Now, where do you try to remove variability? In a manufacturing process, okay? So teams and consensus are very important in process improvement. So Japanese total quality principles are all built on teams and consensus because you're improving the process. But if you need to innovate, you need weird people who think weird thoughts, okay? And if you allow the finance people to say no, 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 you're not going to get any innovation. And that's basically what Ford learned. So what did the guy do? What did Mulally do? Each head designer was responsible to no one, okay? They were totally accountable for the success of the product. So the person who was going to develop the new version of the Fusion, it's up to him for that product to be a success in the marketplace. Now, what does that mean? That means they do need to get input from finance, but they need to stop where they think the finance input doesn't make any sense, okay? They need to talk to manufacturing and make sure that the efficiencies are there and the costs are right. But in fact, manufacturing will try to make their job easy, okay? And the designer needs to know when to push back and say, wait a minute, I'm not going to give up that feature of the car just because it's a little difficult for you guys to manufacture. You can learn how to do that. Let me step back and say, the important thing to take away from this conversation is there's a time for teams, there's a time for consensus, and there's a time for accountability, and be careful how you use the two. It can be very dangerous to misuse them. Last point I want to make is the power of and basically reorganizing. Reorganizing is a powerful tool. If you come into work on a day, you're probably going to do, and if things are as they were yesterday, you're going to do about the same thing. If you come into work and the place is totally reorganized, as I did around quality, it's going to be clear what the organization is trying to achieve. So one of the things that's always a challenge for a leader is a message as to what's important around here these days. And so you need to look for ways to reorganize around what it is you're trying to accomplish. The example I want to use is Canon, a very interesting company. In 1994, this is a company that was very unsuccessful, was dominated by a bunch of product fiefdoms. They had a broad and diverse set of products. Most of their divisions, if not all, were extremely weak, out of control costs and expenses. Their debt was up to $7.4 billion. This is a company that they weren't near bankruptcy, but they were in terrible shape, and the guy must be playing with the knobs over there. From 95 to 2000, very interesting period for this company. They named a new CEO. His name is Fujio Motari. He's still the CEO, by the way. This guy's been immensely successful. He came in and in short order shut down 7 of their major divisions because they were just blatantly unsuccessful. And that left only 3 divisions. And he said, we're going to reorganize the company around only 3 businesses. That is copiers, printers, and cameras. Our goal will be to be number 1 in categories. He put intense focus on cost. He reorganized R&D around major initiatives in these product areas. And he set out to increase the R&D budget from $2.5 billion up to $4.5. So this guy believes in innovation, but also he's quite good in terms of cleaning things up and reorganizing. He set specific R&D goals. He got very specific. One of the things that's important about innovation is that if you just hire a bunch of creative people and say, go create, you're not going to get much. You'll get a lot of wild ideas, but the probability of getting something that's truly useful to you is rather limited. The more specific you can be as to where you want the innovation, it actually helps the innovator, and it improves your chances of getting something useful. In the case of the camera business, he basically said to the R&D people, I want you to meet or beat, importantly Nikon, on single lens reflex cameras. And they were Canon was into lens reflex business. They spent a ton of money on display screens. This guy was really willing to spend on R&D with the idea of these 3 areas, we're going to become number 1. He was good at driving for see, he reorganized manufacturing into what's called cell production. Rather than have a manufacturing line, he formed cells of people who basically made the entire product, as opposed to the product running down a manufacturing line. And it turned out to be very efficient and improved the quality of the product. They also eliminated 18 kilometers of assembly lines. So this at Canon. Today, they're number 2 in the world in patents behind IBM. They're number 1 in cameras. They're, especially the mid-range, the small pocket camera, popular. Copiers are number 1 in the world, but oftentimes the copier that contains their technology doesn't have a Canon name on it. It has a HP name on it, because most of the guts of an HP printer are from Canon. They really have been very innovative in this business. Matari is still the CEO. An incredible success story. So here is get in there and move around to make it clear to employees what it is that you're trying to accomplish. It's a powerful principle. With that, I'll conclude. We can open it up for questions, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask first, is there a different box that's more reliable than what Bob has right now? Moving. If he sits down, it may be better. Okay, thank you.
I'm the problem.
So we don't have very much time left for questions, and I know there's probably a lot of questions from this audience. Please introduce yourself, say who you are, and then ask succinct, brief questions, please. Go ahead.
Michael D. Saturn was set up, a lot of the automobiles. Saturn was set up in 1982 as a new way for GM to innovate. They tried to sell it to Penske, failed, they wound it down 20 years later. What went wrong with Saturn's model within GM?
It got suffocated with the old culture. They wouldn't leave it alone. They had a great idea, which is we're so stuffy that we better start a new car business and let it, happen down in, it was in Tennessee, in the Midwest part of the U.S. But eventually they couldn't hold themselves back. They just, fiddled with it and intruded and basically suffocated the franchise. It's too bad.
Okay, I want to steer this for a minute away from cars. The first principle and the fourth principle.
Yeah.
Game plan to confront reality and shaking up the organization. What do you do if you're not the CEO and your CEO happens to have very different ideas from what you have?
First of all, I should say that the reason why I picked these examples of CEOs is simply they're so vivid, okay? But the principle applies to basically any level of the organization. I mean, if you're in an organization, you're responsible for 6 people, this is your first management job, you should take these principles just as seriously as somebody who's the CEO. You need to confront reality, what's going well here, what isn't going well, and make some changes. That's the fun of being in charge, of doing things, of having an impact. So I think that to take your question, though.
There's a risk in that, though. Risk.
I mean, if you're working for a boss who is just, wretched.
I didn't imply that in any way.
You have to be, you start out being subtle, you end up probably losing your patience, but all you can do is keep working at it. And quite often bosses who maybe aren't as talented as the people working for them can really be improved by the people. If the individual employee simply makes a common sense argument of, I observe this, I think we could do this, and the whole organization would operate better. What do you think, boss? And capture them into a dialogue. So there are a lot of tricks, so to speak, you can use to try and create the dialogue with the boss to try and get them to move. But if that's unsuccessful, you need to vote with your feet.
Okay, thank you very much. Jonathan, and then the question. Please use the microphone, by the way. Thank you.
My name's Jonathan Marshall. I used to be a dot-commer when you were at Microsoft, and we ubiquitously regarded you and Microsoft as the evil empire and thought we had many good reasons for doing so. I was just wondering if you could comment.
That's just an editorial comment.
Could you comment on, did you feel that Microsoft was in any way an evil empire?
No. You know, it's very interesting. Today, in the technology business, Google is the evil empire to most technology companies. And the reason why is because they're the big kahuna, okay? It comes with the territory. In the retail business for many years, Walmart was the evil empire. Why? Because they're the big kahuna. They get a lot of attention. Microsoft was charged with, putting small companies out of business, et cetera, and did that kind of thing happen? Probably so, because that's the technology business. People get wiped out, let's face it. And one would claim that Microsoft is in the process of being wiped out right now, especially on the smartphone, aspect of things. But it somewhat comes with the territory, but on the other hand, don't get me wrong. There's part of what you say that is very true. That was a very aggressive company that basically tackled the future with gusto. And it did, that can be bruising for your competitors. So be it. That, one of the things that I was very involved in the lawsuits, the antitrust lawsuits with the Department of Justice in the United States, and then I was involved with the European lawsuits. And one of the things that was a real education. With the antitrust lawsuits in the US, basically after many, many trials and appeals, we got pretty much a clean bill of health after all that pain. The lawsuits in Europe, we ended up getting beat up horrifically and paying over $2 billion of fines. Now, what's the difference? Antitrust law in the United States is all about protecting consumers. The consumer can't lose in an industry. If they're losing, if they're getting hurt in some way, it's possible that some kind of antitrust is going on. Antitrust law in Europe is about protecting competitors. You're not allowed to beat up and bruise your competitor. Now that's about as anti-US as you're going to find. I mean, that breaks a golden rule of competitive enterprise. And so, is it fun to do business in Europe? Not when you get big. So you ask a very interesting question. Do I say I'm not guilty? No, I say I'm somewhat guilty. I get your point, yeah, but it's I think, part of the nature of the technology business.
Okay,
my name is Nitesh. I'm from the MPA program. I've got two questions, actually. You gave the example of Canon, in which I think about more than $1 billion were pumped in the R&D. I want to know what percentage of the annual budget was this figure in Canon? And the second question is, you talked about that Microsoft appraisal system, in which you said that there was a perforce marking of 5% of the people who were actually not making it. So what impact did it make on those people? I mean, was there a lot of churning among the employees, or did it affect their personnel in any which way?
First question, in terms of Canon, I believe that percentage is about 7.5%, the percent of revenue that goes to R&D, which I think is what you're asking. The second question, a completely different question, is what about churning and losing people at the low end and the like? Microsoft has always had a remarkably low turnover rate. And we used to look at turnover very carefully because it can be a signal that you don't have a good culture, that it's not a fun place to work. But of that 5% that got a 1, typically what would happen is maybe 3 of those percentage points, the person would improve. Or you'd find that you just have them in a terrible job versus their skill profile, and you'd move them somewhere else. In maybe 1 to 2%, you'd actually finally get to a point where they have to leave because we don't have a job that, that fits well.
There's a question here, Saurabh. Go ahead.
My name is Roy, and I'm from the Research Support Unit. Since you've been speaking about the automobile industry, I was wondering why you left out Lee Iacocca from the Chrysler Corporation, because that sets the benchmark for many leaders in the automobile industry. And the second question is, one of the titles of your books is Seduced by Success.
Right.
That almost sounds like success brings in induced wicked traps.
Correct.
How do you explain that?
Number one, not enough time to put Iacocca in there, okay? That's a robust set of experiences that we can all learn from. Seduced by success, I am a firm believer that success is a bad disease that causes people basically to get comfortable and to believe. What happens is when you're successful, you get proud of what you've accomplished. And you have a mentality that if I keep doing what I have been doing, I'm going to continue to be successful. That's not true. They don't realize that. So success creates an incredible vulnerability. And there aren't many organizations that have the culture that constantly avoids that vulnerability. I'll tell you one, and it's Procter & Gamble. That's a company that's now over 175 years old. You go to the annual meeting of the top 10,000 people at that company, and they pull them in from all over the world. It's a 2-day meeting. You would think a bunch of executives get up in front and talk with these people. No. It's all the people. You see example after example of a person who has come up with a bright idea on their product that was very pleasing and of appeal to consumers. It was placed in the market and eventually gained market share. That company is all about coming up with bright ideas that are going to be successful in the marketplace and making them happen. And so you'll see many people up there on the stage that are less than 30 years old, been with the company 6 years, and they're from Thailand, and they've launched this product that's been immensely successful, and we've taken it to 35 countries. I mean, so that's a performance culture. It's all about what's the latest bright idea that excited consumers. You go to many annual meetings of companies, and the whole deal is, didn't we have a great year? I mean, it's all about highlights, and even if there aren't any highlights, they'll create them, And also, Microsoft culture was very paranoid. Every presentation at Microsoft, you had to start out with, you couldn't start out with a highlights slide. You literally start out with a slide called lowlights. And usually in the presentations, you never got past the lowlights slide, okay? And after a while, I was shocked because, this is very different. But I soon began to realize that what happens in most meetings is people don't want to talk about the real hard issues, okay? They want to spend a lot of time convincing you that they're smart, and they also want to remind you of all their accomplishments. And by that time they get through that, you got 10 minutes left to deal with the real issue. So Bill Gates was basically trying to get around that and saying, let's not waste each other's time. We know what's going well. Let's talk about the lowlights. It was an incredibly productive culture. Kind of feeds, though, your point about Microsoft being aggressive. Yeah, they are a very aggressive bunch. Other questions?
Question from the back.
Hi, Robert. Thanks for the insightful talk. Really
Sure.
enjoyed it. And
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Asim, and I'm co-founder of a web startup. And the question I really had was that, you mentioned about people overthinking on tough problems. And that's something, which we've seen with big companies. We've also seen to some extent with startups where, my background is that of an engineer and over-analyzing problems. Has there any, like from your personal experience, have you found any, tips or advice you could share when you kind of, feel that you might be over-analyzing and it's time to just make a decision based on your gut feeling rather than, just trying to overthink it?
Well, I think it's a talent that needs to be developed, and it's usually developed by bouncing your current thinking off of other people. So your peers are very important as basically a vehicle for sounding out whether or not you are missing something. So, you know, we talked about consensus. It is important to talk to other people and to get input. It's just that don't do that for a living. You know, eventually get to a point where you're making some decisions. But, you know, bouncing it off of others, very, very valuable.
I want to ask you a question about
Sure.
organizational culture, particularly with Procter & Gamble, because it's such an old company, so well respected, and the employees say nice things
Yeah.
about it. So in over 100+ years of history, how has that organizational culture, the DNA of that organization, been passed down from one generation to the next?
I think it's primarily through what gets rewarded. And what gets rewarded there is, as I said before, performance and coming up with bright ideas. It's a company that, you'll get a kick out of this. It's a marketing company, make no bones about it, and they're very clear about that with their employees. And in fact, the marketing arm of Procter & Gamble is treated, they operate very differently than the rest of the company. The rest of the company is much more traditional in terms of they hire people only from campus. They tend to be there for their whole career. And they really do a great job of training. In marketing, they hire the best, I mean the creme de la creme every year from the best schools, not marketing schools. You can be a religion major and get a job in marketing at Procter & Gamble. I ended up being the senior VP of marketing, never had a marketing course in my life. I'm a computer science PhD, so you said, that's weird, isn't it? But in marketing, every year they hire the horde of these talented people, and they tell them at the end of 12 months, 1/3 of you will be fired, okay? Because we're really after the absolute cream of the crop. And then at the end of the second year, another 1/3 are going to be fired, okay? And they do that. So you people like Jeff Immelt, the CEO of General Electric, he lasted 2 years. Meg Whitman, the lady who ran for governor of California, she lasted 1 year. Steve Ballmer, the guy who's running Microsoft, he lasted 2 years, okay? Now, were these really bad performers? No, they just weren't as focused and productive as others. So they end up with really high quality talent. But the important thing from a marketing standpoint is the consumer products industry, and in fact many industries that are dependent on marketing, are full of Procter & Gamble alumni. Why? Because they turn out, they let a lot of them go, but it's great training. And everybody knows that these are really talented people. So it's not like a negative mark to get fired from Procter & Gamble after 2 years. It's actually a great set of experiences. But from a culture standpoint, it simply endorses and reinforces that same principle of you come up with bright ideas that got lots of share points in the marketplace on your product. So
We'll take one last question. So over there, please. Just speak out loud.
they didn't left, they were fired. It would take too long. I mean, you're getting very talented people, and you're making bets quickly in terms of what you think are people that really adapt to the performance culture and adapt to the consumer products industry. You also do run into people who decide they don't want to be in that industry. In the case of Steve, it's an interesting story. He was at Harvard, and his first year and a half, he played poker a lot with Bill Gates. And the two ended up with a very tight relationship. And Bill constantly, through Steve's 4 years at Harvard, badgered him to come work for him in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is where he started Microsoft. And Steve said, no, my dad would kill me if I leave. So he finished at Harvard, and he wanted to go into industry, but he didn't want to go with a small company at first. So he joined Procter & Gamble, and then Bill started working on him again. After 2 years, Steve couldn't decide what he wanted to do. Should I go join Bill? He decided to go to business school at Stanford. So he starts in first year of business school at Stanford, and about 3/4 of the way through is when he decided to quit that and go join Bill Gates. But so there are people that basically are still finding their way also. But you know, personnel handling is, you got to be very careful to nurture people, to make judgments with them. But on the other hand, you also need to be frank with them about what you're observing in terms of how they're going to fit in the industry, how productive they've been. So personnel management, it's a tough area. It really is.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Robert Herbold for a very lively and practical session.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
There's books outside.